This video outlines the overall debate which is currently underway in the UK. At the moment, there is no legal duty to report known or suspected child abuse to a local authority in England, except for cases of FGM. I say England because Northern Ireland does have a statutory duty to report any indictable offence as part of its anti-terrorism legislation, which includes child abuse but was not conceived of with the needs of children in mind. Nevertheless, it's technically inaccurate to say that there's no legal duty anywhere in the UK. Also, Wales have recently created a legal duty to report, but departs from the vast majority of reporting systems by having no sanction for failure to report. This video is aimed at people who work with children and who therefore have a safeguarding role, or for anyone who is interested in this aspect of our child protection framework. The government has released various documents of policy and guidance which emphasise the importance of reporting concerns, but it is not an offence to fail to do so. This topic has become more relevant in recent years following the government consultation on reporting and acting on child abuse and neglect, which came about as a result of Amendment 43 tabled by Baroness Walmsley during the passage of the Serious Crimes Bill 2014. The consultation sought views on the introduction of two possible new measures: mandatory reporting or a duty to act, which, to put it simply, does not amount to a legal duty carrying sanction and which is therefore indistinguishable from the current system of reporting, which is based on professional discretion as opposed to law. So, when I'm talking about introducing mandatory reporting, what I mean is a specific duty written into legislation which crucially carries some form of punishment for non-compliance. For the purposes of this video, I will also be focusing on child sexual abuse, as opposed to mandatory reporting for other forms of child maltreatment. This is important because the research on sexual abuse is sometimes conflated with other forms, and the data can be quite different. It is the secrecy of child sexual abuse and the immense difficulty children have in disclosing which make a legal duty to report particularly relevant as part of a possible solution. The government ended up rejecting both of the proposals in its consultation and opted instead for its own alternative arrangements. I will address the arguments for the government's rejection of mandatory reporting, as well as those which I have heard voiced by a range of professionals at the recent seminar on this subject held by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, IICSA. First of all, there's the argument that mandatory reporting is unnecessary, as the UK already has a high rate of referrals made to child protective agencies, and there is no evidence of whole-scale institutional failure to report abuse. This is simply untrue. We know from various serious case reviews that there have been many instances of staff either explicitly knowing or having good reason to suspect sexual abuse but did not report their knowledge. This has been recognised as one causal factor in how the abuse was able to continue for as long as it did in those cases. So we know that the system in its current form is allowing some children to fall between the gaps of existing reporting procedures. It must be emphasised that the existing procedures are not legally required and therefore can be ignored. In my role as someone who runs training for professionals, I am often hearing how individual staff members are unclear on what the reporting procedures are within their organisations. I have even had one lady insist that we already have mandatory reporting, which is not the case. At this point, you might be wondering what happens to staff who fail to report abuse under the current system. The honest answer is we don't really know. Whenever people describe the range of professional sanctions available under the current system, I do ask them, do we have any knowledge of any specific case where a failure to report abuse has led to any kind of sanction? And the answer is no. That data is not collected in the UK. Why isn't it collected? Who knows? I just know that it isn't. So what they're saying is, we don't need a new law because our current arrangements are enough. Okay, so what happens to people who fail to report under the current arrangements? We don't know. It doesn't fill one with confidence. From here, it makes sense to clarify the purpose of mandatory reporting legislation. It is not, contrary to popular belief perhaps, meant to punish professionals for not acting at the very first whiff of a suspicion of abuse. It is not trying to catch people out. Existing legislation in other countries highlights that it applies where there is significant harm involved. It is meant to consolidate our safeguarding duties by making it crystal clear what is expected of us as professionals and to demonstrate how serious the government is about tackling child sexual abuse. A change in law promotes a change in culture, which everyone agrees needs to happen. Opponents think that the needed cultural change can be achieved without creating a criminal offence for failure to report. But the recent as well as historic institutional failings prove that something more is needed, and that something more certainly isn't yet another piece of statutory guidance, because we've had that already and it didn't compel professionals to report in Rotherham, or in Telford, or in the BBC, or any of the others. Please note the word statutory in the context of statutory guidance is completely meaningless. It is not backed by statute, therefore it is only guidance. There's nothing statutory about it, so please read it with a critical eye and constantly ask yourselves, is any of this legally required? Another counter-argument to the introduction of mandatory reporting is that it will create an influx of false reports which will overburden the already under-resourced social system and divert resources away from genuine cases. There is no empirical basis for this argument. So now, why don't we look at the available research to find out if this actually happens in jurisdictions which have already taken this step? Over 80% of developed nations and the vast majority of developing nations have some form of mandatory reporting. Professor Matthews of Queensland University of Technology in Australia has conducted several studies of the effects of mandatory reporting both before and after implementation. You see, every state in Australia has these laws, but they each have different requirements for who must report, whether it's specific groups of professionals or simply every citizen, what must be reported. All of them mandate for child sexual abuse, but some exclude other forms of maltreatment, such as neglect or exposure to domestic violence, and when a report must be made. They also differ on what the possible sanction is for failing to report. It's anything from a fine to imprisonment, but they do all have some form of legal consequences. The only exception is in New South Wales, where, after over a decade of carrying a punishment for non-compliance, they reverted to a legal duty with no specific sanction. Reporting outcomes remained stable after that change, but having a sanction in the first place was still deemed necessary in those early years, whilst the needed cultural change around reporting took effect. This tells us a few things. Firstly, that Australia is a hotbed of opportunity for comparative analysis of various forms of legislation. Secondly, that each state in Australia has deemed mandatory reporting to be worthy of implementation, and that given the demographic similarities between Australia and the UK, it is plausible that any introduction in the UK would not be wildly different from the Australian experience. It's also worth noting that not a single jurisdiction within Australia, but also throughout every state in America and Canada, has dismantled mandatory reporting laws after implementing them. There have been various inquiries to find out how the system is performing, and these have helped to shape how the law operates over time. But not a single jurisdiction has gone back to a discretionary model once they have taken that step. What does the research tell us? I will now share an excerpt from the IICSA seminar where Professor Matthews explains the findings of one of his studies to an audience of policymakers and heads of safeguarding. I will post the link to the seminar below so you can watch the whole thing for yourself. There are 5 studies which he discusses in total. Here is just one of them.
So in this study we asked the core question, what happens before and after introducing a mandatory reporting law for child sexual abuse? And the nature of this study was to analyse trends in numbers of reports of sexual abuse and the outcomes of those reports. That is, were they investigated? If they were investigated, were they substantiated or not? Before and after introduction of the reporting law in Western Australia, which happened on the 1st of January 2009. So it's quite recent in terms of Australian history and in fact world history in introducing mandatory reporting. It gave us a nice neat cut-off to be able to conduct this analysis. Now I'll just point out that we used a couple of measures to explore the impact of reporting practice. We used numbers of reports, we used numbers of investigated reports, and we used numbers of substantiated reports by these 4 professions combined. Okay, now the numbers of substantiated reports that's a really strong measure of the impact of introducing reporting laws. But it's also a conservative measure, because many people in the field believe that the best, most appropriate measure is actually the number of investigated reports, because they include both reports that are substantiated and reports where there's likely to be some form of need that the child has. They've been deemed sufficiently pertinent by the Child Protection Agency to merit a formal report. Okay, so they may involve harm even if not substantiated. They may involve some level of abuse even if not technically substantiated. So what we found here, first of all, with the reporting law in this state only applying to sexual abuse and only applying to doctors, teachers, nurses and police. And we compared reports by those four groups for 3 years before the law commenced with 4 years after the law commenced. And just one more explanatory comment. When these laws are introduced, they should be, and nearly always are, preceded by a systematic campaign of education for the mandated reporter group, so that they know the nature of their reporting duty, what they should and should not report. So you may even expect to see some more reports being made even before the law actually commences. But we can just hold that to one side. So 3 major findings came from this study. In terms of annual means of numbers of reports, they increased from 662 per annum before the law commenced to 2,448 after the law commenced. So the raw number of reports increased by a factor of 3.7. That's a substantial increase. Okay? And the child protection system in Western Australia had to be prepared for that. And at first, it may not have been fully prepared, but it then added further resources to handle that. Second major finding, number of investigated reports increased from an annual mean before the reporting law of 451 to an annual mean after the reporting law commenced of 1,363, virtually a trebling, 3 times. And the third major finding was that the number of substantiated reports doubled from pre-law 160 to post-law 327. That's a doubling in the number of children identified as victims of sexual abuse every year in that jurisdiction. It's hard to conceive of that as anything other than a substantial gain in child protection.
So when the government says, as it did in its reasons for rejecting mandatory reporting, that the evidence isn't clear enough or that there is no academic consensus, then we must examine what that means. Whilst it's true that there's not an excess of studies in this area, it is also arguing in bad faith to say that the existing research is insufficient, because insufficient is one of those words that can mean whatever you need it to mean. How much is enough? The evidence so far answers all the obvious questions. What is the impact of the laws? Do they lead to an increase in reports? How many of those reports are substantiated? Is the overall economic burden manageable or debilitating? Were there any unintended consequences? Also, a point on substantiation. In order to be substantiated, a report must demonstrate evidence of maltreatment and evidence of harm. One or the other won't do. So you see, the threshold for substantiation is quite high, and it's for this reason that substantiation as a whole is not necessarily a good measure of the efficacy of mandatory reporting laws. It represents the most conservative of outcomes. Does mandatory reporting cause an unbearable rise in false reporting? No. Does it create a culture of fear within organisations? Not as far as we know. Speaking of fear, the only people who might be afraid of these new laws would be the potential perpetrators. Like any would-be criminal, they make a risk assessment of whether to act or not based on how likely they think it is that they will be caught. A culture where there is a clear reporting duty backed by law is one which is more threatening to someone who is thinking about abusing children than a situation where people are often left unclear on the who, what and how of reporting their concerns. However, it should be noted that there's no research that I'm aware of which has looked at the impact of mandatory reporting in terms of preventing someone from offending in the first place. It just seems to make sense. No one is suggesting that mandatory reporting is a panacea. It needs to be brought in addition to training on the duty for all newly mandated professionals. There should also be an ongoing evaluation process, just as there has been in other jurisdictions, to ensure that the new framework is working as it should. This, in turn, relies on accurate data collection on who is reporting what. By being so behind most of the world in introducing mandatory reporting, the UK can learn from the implementation issues experienced by other jurisdictions to create the best system possible. That's why listening to the research is crucial. In addition, professionals should not be afraid of sticking their foot in it by changing their view from against to for. You see, we all agree that safeguarding is everyone's business. We all do solemnly nod and concur with these pleasant maxims that you hear in this field over and over again. Given that mandatory reporting is an evidence-based policy response, and given that it also has the support, by the way, of the vast majority of people with direct experience of child sexual abuse, with over 86% of the inquiry's survivor forum coming out in favour, it is difficult to reconcile these platitudes about the importance of safeguarding with being against mandatory reporting. It's also difficult to remain credibly neutral once you've been presented with the evidence. If you're neutral, then what are you waiting for? What exactly is your evidentiary threshold, and how will you know when it has been met? It seems to me, judging by what I heard at the inquiry seminar, that most organisations will remain unconvinced until the Department for Education eventually come round to being in favour. Then watch how quickly all these safeguarding agencies start saying, of course we support mandatory reporting because safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. The inquiry's investigation into mandatory reporting has yet to reach a conclusion. If they do make a recommendation to government, then I suspect that the next big frontier will be how the prospective new legislation should be worded. The fact that Mandate Now, who are leading the agenda for introducing new laws, have already drafted clear legislation will probably be duly ignored for some time. Thank you for tuning in for this video. I hope you found it informative and useful and maybe a bit thought-provoking. Please subscribe and leave your comments below, and I will see you next time.
Siobhan Pyburn from Southampton was 17 when she started her campaign. 10 years later, she's one of the country's most prominent female activists, speaks at conferences and trains professionals.